By 1943, Germany was running out of time. The early victories were gone, burned away in the snow of the Eastern Front and the deserts of North Africa. Allied bombers now crossed the Reich in daylight, tearing holes in factories Hitler had once believed untouchable. Every month, the war demanded more steel, more fuel, more men, things Germany no longer had in abundance. And that was when Hitler placed his faith in a secret. Not diplomacy. Not strategy. A weapon. Deep inside underground facilities, hidden from Allied reconnaissance and even from much of the German High Command, engineers worked on what Hitler believed would reverse the war in a single stroke. It would terrify the enemy, shatter morale, force negotiations. A Wunderwaffe, a miracle weapon. On paper, it was revolutionary. Faster, more advanced, more destructive than anything the Allies possessed. Hitler spoke of it obsessively, demanding progress reports, overriding generals, funneling resources into the project while entire armies went short of ammunition. What he did not understand, what no one dared tell him, was that this weapon would never be used the way he imagined. And worse, by chasing it, Germany would cripple itself. The weapon did not fail because it was weak. It failed because it arrived at the wrong time, in the wrong way, for the wrong war. And in failing, it saved thousands of lives on the other side of the front. Allied aircrews. Civilians. Soldiers who should have faced German divisions that never arrived, because steel, fuel, and men had been diverted into a project that could not win the war. Hitler believed this weapon would force the Allies to their knees. Instead, it drained the Reich dry. And when it was finally unleashed, the world would discover that Germany's greatest secret had already backfired. Hitler had always believed technology could compensate for numbers. From the very beginning of the war, he trusted weapons more than men, innovation more than logistics. Blitzkrieg itself had reinforced that belief. Speed, surprise, and machinery had crushed opponents before they could react. But by 1942, the equation had changed. Germany was now fighting a war of attrition it could not afford. Allied factories ran around the clock. American production dwarfed anything the Reich could match. Soviet manpower seemed endless. German generals understood the danger clearly. Hitler did not. Instead, he doubled down on miracles. In private conferences, he dismissed traditional military concerns. Infantry shortages could be solved with superior weapons. Fuel shortages could be overcome with breakthroughs. Bombing could be stopped with technological leaps. And so the Wunderwaffe program was born, not as a single project, but as an ideology. Jet aircraft. Rocket weapons. Massive tanks. Advanced submarines. Each promised decisive results. Each demanded enormous resources, and none could be delivered in the numbers or timeframe the war required. Among all of them, one program captured Hitler's imagination more than any other. It would strike the enemy directly. It would bypass front lines. It would punish civilians and shatter morale. A weapon that needed no pilot, no battlefield, no warning. German engineers called it a vengeance weapon. Hitler called it destiny. The project was hidden under layers of secrecy. Workers were sworn to silence. Facilities were buried underground. Even Luftwaffe commanders were kept at arm's length. To Hitler, this weapon was not merely tactical, it was psychological. He believed that terror could replace strategy, that fear could succeed where armies had stalled. What he refused to acknowledge was cost. Steel that could have built thousands of fighters was poured into launch ramps. Fuel that could have trained pilots was reserved for test firings. Engineers who could have improved proven aircraft were reassigned to theoretical designs that required years of refinement. Every delay at the front was justified by the promise of the weapon. Soon, Hitler said. Very soon. By the time Allied intelligence began to detect something unusual, strange concrete structures along the French coast, unusual transport movements, increased activity in hidden facilities, the Reich had already committed itself fully. There would be no turning back. And when the first weapon finally launched, it did exactly what it was designed to do. It terrified. But terror alone does not win wars. And this terror would soon expose a fatal flaw, one that the Allies would exploit mercilessly. The first launch did not look like victory. There was no parade, no triumphant broadcast, no immediate realization that history had shifted. Just a low mechanical roar rising from a hidden ramp, followed by fire, violent, unnatural, and then silence as the weapon vanished into the sky. Minutes later, miles away, it came down. The explosion was sudden, indiscriminate, and terrifying. Buildings collapsed, windows shattered, civilians were killed without warning. No sirens, no fighters to intercept, no bombs to hear falling. For the first time in the war, the enemy had no immediate defense. Hitler was ecstatic. At last, proof. At last, a weapon that bypassed Allied air superiority and struck directly at the heart. Reports were rushed to Berlin, carefully worded to emphasize shock and damage. Hitler ordered production increased immediately. Mori launches. Mori sites. Mori resources. What the reports did not emphasize was accuracy. The weapon could not be aimed precisely. It followed crude guidance, its course affected by wind, weather, and manufacturing tolerances. Some crashed harmlessly into fields. Others failed seconds after launch. Many never reached their intended targets at all. To Hitler, this did not matter. Terror was the objective. But terror has consequences, and the Allies reacted far faster than the Germans expected. Within days, reconnaissance aircraft were mapping launch sites. Analysts pieced together trajectories. Engineers studied debris and calculated flight characteristics. What had been secret was now a puzzle, and puzzles could be solved. And while Hitler celebrated, something far more important was happening quietly. German divisions were still short of tanks. Luftwaffe squadrons still lacked fuel. Infantry units still waited for replacements. But the steel, concrete, and manpower continued flowing into the weapon. Every launch was expensive. Every ramp was a magnet for bombers. Every engineer reassigned was a loss elsewhere. The secret weapon had finally arrived. And the war had already moved past what it could do. The flaw was not in the weapon itself. It was in how predictable it was. Once Allied analysts collected enough wreckage, the picture became clear. The weapon followed a fixed trajectory. It launched from known angles. It required specific infrastructure, large concrete ramps, fuel storage, transport links that could not be hidden for long. What had been designed as an unstoppable terror weapon was suddenly constrained by physics. And physics could be bombed. Allied commanders did not panic. They adapted. Instead of chasing individual launches, they targeted the system behind them. Reconnaissance flights began mapping suspected sites daily. Resistance networks in occupied Europe reported unusual construction. Photo interpreters worked around the clock, circling shapes on grainy images. The response was methodical. Bombers struck launch ramps before they were operational. Rail lines feeding the sites were cut repeatedly. Fuel depots vanished overnight. Entire German air defense zones were forced to protect empty concrete instead of factories and cities. This was the backfire. To protect the secret weapon, Germany had to reveal it. Every ramp became a beacon, drawing Allied firepower away from population centers and onto empty countryside. Bombers that might have flattened cities were redirected to forests, cliffs, and fields. Thousands of civilians were spared, not because the weapon was merciful, but because it absorbed Allied attention like a sponge. And there was more. The weapon's inaccuracy forced the Germans to fire it in large numbers to achieve psychological impact. Large numbers meant massive production demands. Each unit consumed scarce fuel, rare metals, and skilled labor. Labor Germany no longer had. As the launches continued, Allied casualty estimates revealed an uncomfortable truth for Hitler's inner circle. The weapon was killing far fewer people than expected. Not because it wasn't dangerous, but because it was unreliable. Meanwhile, German losses elsewhere mounted. Fighter pilots flew fewer hours. Tank units sat idle. Infantry formations went into battle under strength, all while engineers obsessed over fixing guidance issues that could never truly be solved in time. The Wunderwaffe had become a strategic black hole. It consumed everything and gave nothing back. By late 1944, the damage was no longer theoretical. German generals could feel it in their reports: missing units, delayed deliveries, shortages that made no sense on paper but were devastating in reality. Entire divisions waited for equipment that never arrived. Luftwaffe commanders begged for fuel allocations that were quietly denied. Because the weapon came first. Trains that should have carried tanks instead hauled components. Factories capable of producing fighters were ordered to manufacture parts that exploded once and were gone forever. Skilled engineers were pulled away from proven designs to solve problems that no longer mattered. This was the true cost. Not the explosions in enemy cities, but the silence on German battlefields where reinforcements should have been. On the Western Front, Allied advances met weaker resistance than expected. Units surrendered sooner. Counterattacks stalled quickly. German officers reported something unthinkable earlier in the war: they could not hold ground even when they wanted to. In the air, Allied bombers encountered fewer interceptors. Pilot training hours had been cut. Fuel reserves were prioritized for launches, not dogfights. Every hour of flight time lost meant more bombers getting through. And those bombers did not just hit cities. They destroyed bridges, marshalling yards, fuel plants, targets that shortened the war. The weapon that was supposed to punish the enemy had instead exposed Germany's vulnerability. Allied planners knew where German priorities lay and exploited them relentlessly. Meanwhile, civilian morale inside Germany continued to collapse. The secret weapon had been promised as salvation. Instead, it brought more bombing, more shortages, more broken promises. The terror campaign did not break Allied will. It hardened it. And as Allied armies crossed borders and closed in, the scale of what the weapon had failed to do became undeniable. It had not stopped the invasion. It had not slowed the advance. It had not forced negotiations. It had only delayed Germany's recognition of defeat. And in that delay, countless lives were spared. Lives that would have been lost in prolonged ground battles, desperate last stands, and even bloodier assaults. No one celebrated the numbers at the time. The Allies did not issue press releases declaring how many lives had been spared. There were no victory charts showing casualties that didn't happen. History rarely records absences. But planners noticed. In staff rooms and intelligence briefings, analysts began comparing projections with reality. Expected losses from German fighter interception were lower than forecast. Ground resistance in certain sectors collapsed faster than models predicted. Civilian casualty rates in several cities dropped when bombing priorities shifted toward launch sites instead of urban centers. All of it traced back to one obsession. The secret weapon had become a gravitational pull on German strategy. To defend it, Germany redeployed anti-aircraft guns away from cities. To supply it, rail traffic was rerouted from frontline units. To build it, underground factories consumed labor that could have sustained conventional arms. Every decision created gaps. And through those gaps, people lived. Allied bomber crews flew missions that would have been suicidal earlier in the war and came home. Infantry units advanced against weakened defenses and survived engagements that planners once believed would be catastrophic. Civilians slept through nights that would otherwise have burned. Even inside occupied Europe, the effect was felt. Bombing focused on isolated sites rather than population centers. Resistance networks found German patrol patterns disrupted as units were reassigned to guard concrete and empty launch rails. The weapon had inverted its purpose. It was designed to terrorize civilians into submission. Instead, it forced the Reich to protect machinery instead of people, while the Allies adapted, hardened, and advanced. German scientists understood this before anyone else. Privately, some admitted the truth. Even if the weapon worked perfectly, it could not compensate for lost air superiority, depleted fuel, and collapsing logistics. But the machine had momentum now. Hitler demanded results, not reality. So the launches continued. And each one marked not a step toward victory, but another missed opportunity to shorten the war on Germany's terms. By early 1945, the conclusion was unavoidable. The weapon had not saved Germany. It had saved time for the Allies. And time in war is measured in lives. After the war, the weapon's remains were studied in silence. Engineers admired its ingenuity. Historians debated its potential. Popular culture inflated its menace. It became a symbol of Nazi technological ambition, sleek, futuristic, terrifying. But symbols are easier than truth. The truth was quieter. The weapon represented a failure of strategy masquerading as innovation, a belief that technology could replace judgment, that fear could substitute for logistics, that miracles could override mathematics. It could not. The Allies won not because they were immune to terror, but because they adapted faster, produced more, and refused to gamble everything on a single answer to a complex war. Hitler never accepted this. Until the final days in Berlin, he spoke of weapons that would still change everything. If only they had arrived sooner, if only the war had waited. It never does. The secret weapon did fire. It did kill. It did terrify. But it also drained the Reich of its last strength, exposed its priorities, and shortened the war it was meant to win. And in doing so, it saved thousands of lives, people who would never know how close they came to dying, or that their survival hinged on a decision made in a bunker, driven by obsession instead of reality. That is the paradox of history. Sometimes the deadliest weapons do their greatest damage, not to the enemy, but to the side that builds them.